Kayla Davis took a deep breath as she approached the courthouse. The towering building loomed before her, its stone walls a silent reminder of how long this place had stood. She had been here many times before, though always in a more casual manner, accompanying her father, Mayor Samuel Davis, to meetings or events, watching the workings of local government from the sidelines. But today was different. Today, she was the one facing the judge, a minor offense that had somehow escalated into something far more stressful. Kayla had always prided herself on being diligent. She was responsible, always on top of things, whether it was work, appointments, or keeping her car's paperwork in order. But like everyone else, she had her slip-ups. Her registration had expired 2 months ago, a detail she had missed in the chaos of her busy schedule. It was a small mistake, one that anyone could make. And yet, here she was, standing before Judge Henry Collins, a figure known for his strict, no-nonsense approach to the law. Miss Davis, the judge's deep voice cut through the quiet room, his gaze sharp as it met hers. "You've been charged with failure to renew your vehicle registration. Do you have any explanation for this?" Kayla squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze evenly. "Your Honor, I simply missed the deadline. It wasn't intentional, and I've already taken care of it. I've submitted the renewal forms online. The car's up to date now." Judge Collins didn't react immediately. His expression was unreadable as he glanced down at the papers in front of him. The courtroom was eerily silent, save for the occasional shuffle of papers. Kayla's palms were slightly sweaty, but she remained composed. She had dealt with tougher situations in the past. She was used to public speaking, handling the pressures of her father's high-profile role in town. But this was different. There was something about standing in front of a judge, someone with the power to decide her fate, that made her feel small. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge spoke. "Given that this was a minor infraction, I'll waive any additional penalties, but I must impose a fine of $500 for the late registration." He paused, locking eyes with her. "I hope this serves as a reminder to keep your affairs in order, Miss Davis." Kayla's heart sank. She had expected a fine, but $500. For something so minor. She opened her mouth to protest, but caught herself. Arguing in court wasn't going to change anything. Instead, she nodded, accepting the ruling. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she turned to leave, she noticed a few curious glances from the people in the room, some whispering to each other. It didn't take long for her to realize why. The fine, the judge's harsh tone, it didn't make sense. Was it just a coincidence that this fine felt heavier than any other? Or had her last name, Davis, played a part in the decision? Kayla pushed the thought from her mind, determined to move forward. But as she stepped outside, the whispers grew louder. As Kayla stepped out of the courthouse and into the blinding midday sun, she tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in her chest. The fine was hefty for something so trivial, but she could deal with it. She had dealt with worse. What bothered her more was the way the judge had looked at her, as if the small mistake had somehow warranted more than just a fine. She wondered, briefly, if it was because of who she was. Mayor Samuel Davis's daughter. She shook the thought away, trying to focus on getting through the day. But as she walked toward her car, she couldn't ignore the murmurs from a small group of people waiting outside. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a well-worn suit, nodded toward her as she passed, his voice low but clear. "That's the mayor's daughter, right?" Kayla froze for a moment, her fingers tightening on her purse strap. She didn't stop walking, but the realization that the conversation was about her, her personal life, not just her traffic fine, stirred something inside her. Her father had been mayor for over a decade, a respected figure in the town, but Kayla had always kept a low profile. She wasn't interested in politics. She preferred to work quietly behind the scenes, building a career and a life that wasn't defined by her family's name. She didn't need people thinking they knew her just because they knew her father. As she reached her car and unlocked the door, she overheard another voice. "What's she doing here? A fine for something like that. I thought she'd get special treatment." The words stung more than they should have. Special treatment. It wasn't the first time she had wondered if her last name had gotten her both opportunities and challenges. Growing up in the shadow of her father's political career had its advantages, but it also came with expectations, both fair and unfair. She had always tried to prove herself on her own merit, but moments like these made her question whether people ever truly saw her for who she was, or just as a reflection of her father's power. Kyla started the car and pulled out of the lot, her mind racing. She had to admit there was something unsettling about the whole situation. The judge's quick decision, the fine that felt too much for a simple oversight, the whispers in the crowd. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but part of her wondered if the fine had less to do with the traffic violation and more to do with her connection to the mayor. She drove through the town's quiet streets, the weight of the fine pressing down on her chest. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just an unfortunate coincidence. But deep down, Kyla couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time her father's name would follow her into a room. And somehow, she knew that the consequences of this moment would stretch far beyond just a $500 ticket. That evening, as Judge Henry Collins sat alone in his study, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The fine he had imposed on Kyla Davis felt too severe for a minor oversight. He had been firm, yes. His reputation in the town was built on being decisive, on following the law with no room for exceptions. But as he sifted through the paperwork from her case again, something gnawed at him. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk, his mind wandering back to her. Kayla had been calm, composed. The way she had accepted the fine without protest made him pause. Most people would have objected or tried to talk their way out of it, but she had simply nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips, almost as if she expected it. Judge Collins frowned. He was accustomed to seeing people react with frustration or anger, but Kayla didn't react at all. Not really. It was as though she had already anticipated this moment. He glanced down at the case file again, running his finger over the name. Davis. Kyla Davis. His brow furrowed as a thought struck him, one that hadn't fully clicked during the proceedings. The name had sounded familiar, but it hadn't registered at first. Suddenly, the realization hit him like a thunderclap. She's the mayor's daughter. The judge stiffened in his chair, his fingers going still on the paper. Samuel Davis, the mayor of their town, had been in office for years. Well respected, highly regarded. It was impossible to ignore the fact that his position came with a certain level of scrutiny. Judge Collins had known the mayor for years and had always thought of him as a man of principle. But now, sitting in the quiet of his study, the judge wondered if he had made a mistake. The fine felt too harsh, too impersonal. Kyla's status as the mayor's daughter should not have mattered, but he couldn't deny the nagging feeling that it had colored his judgment. He had given her the fine without thinking twice, without fully considering her situation. He hadn't even connected the dots during the hearing. The realization that she was the daughter of the town's most influential figure suddenly made him question his own decisions. He sat back in his chair, a weight pressing on his chest. He had a reputation for fairness. But did he? Was his decision truly impartial, or had something else influenced it? Judge Collins rubbed his eyes and sighed. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had acted too swiftly, without considering all the angles. What bothered him the most was the uncertainty now lingering in his mind. Had I been fair? It was a question that would keep him awake long into the night. As he glanced over the case again, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The fine was just the beginning. That night, Mayor Samuel Davis sat in his office, reviewing city reports, the hum of his computer screen the only sound in the room. He was accustomed to the steady rhythm of his duties, the daily decisions that came with being the town's leader. But tonight, his mind was elsewhere, lingering on an unexpected phone call from his daughter, Kyla. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something," Kyla had said, her voice calm but tinged with something he couldn't place. When she told him about the fine, his first instinct was to laugh it off, thinking it was a small thing, nothing more than a bureaucratic glitch. But as Kayla explained the details, something in her tone made him pause. His daughter wasn't one to complain over trivial matters. "The judge just fined me $500 for an expired registration," she had said. "I've already updated it, but it just feels off." Samuel had nodded, though Kayla couldn't see him. "I'm sure it's nothing, sweetheart. Sometimes judges just follow the letter of the law. It's routine." But something about the way she spoke made him reconsider. Kayla hadn't asked for special treatment, and that was precisely why her voice seemed so restrained. She never did. In fact, that was part of the reason why he admired her. She had always kept a low profile, never used his position to her advantage. But now, as the details settled in, Samuel felt his frustration grow. A fine for something as small as an expired registration didn't feel right. That was when he started to wonder, was this really about the registration, or was there something more to it? He couldn't ignore the question that kept creeping into his mind. Was the judge's decision influenced by who Kayla was? Could it be that Judge Collins had been harsher on her because of her last name? He knew the judge wasn't the type to act out of bias, but the thought gnawed at him. His daughter was a private citizen, not a public figure. She shouldn't be judged any differently than anyone else, regardless of her father's position. But in this small town where everyone seemed to know everyone's business, he couldn't deny that her family name had a weight of its own. Samuel stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The fine was one thing. The principle behind it was another. If the judge had let his personal knowledge of Kayla's family influence his decision, that wasn't just a mistake, it was an injustice. He paced the room, his mind spinning. Should he confront Judge Collins directly? Or was there another way to address this without turning it into a spectacle? Whatever the solution was, one thing was certain: this wasn't something he could let slide. Not when it involved his daughter. The news of Kayla's fine spread quickly through the town, and within hours, it was the talk of every coffee shop, local diner, and social media thread. It wasn't just about a minor traffic infraction anymore. It had become a story with layers. Whispers were exchanged over dinner tables, and murmurs filled the aisles of the local grocery store. People who had never before noticed the mayor's daughter were now paying attention, analyzing every detail, every decision. Local news outlets caught wind of the situation, and soon the story made its way to the evening broadcasts. Kayla Davis, daughter of Mayor Samuel Davis, fined $500 for an expired registration. The simple, straightforward headline barely scratched the surface of what had actually happened. As the story picked up momentum, some began to ask questions that went beyond the facts of the fine. Was this an isolated case? Was there more to it than just a missed deadline? Among the people most interested in the unfolding drama were a small group of local activists and community members who had long been critical of the town's systems, even if they hadn't always voiced their concerns publicly. They began to dig deeper into Judge Henry Collins' past decisions, comparing how he handled fines and judgments for others in the town, particularly those who, like Kayla, were known to have connections to prominent families. As they pieced together information, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Judge Collins, for all his reputation for being strict, appeared to have levied harsher fines on people from certain backgrounds. Some residents began to share stories of their own dealings with the judge, minor offenses punished with severe penalties, while others had received what seemed like leniency. While the judge's record didn't raise alarm bells on the surface, the details told a different story. His decisions seemed inconsistent, particularly in cases where the defendant's social standing or last name might carry weight. The activists, driven by a sense of injustice, decided to make their findings public, posting them on local online forums and social media. It wasn't long before the story gained traction. The town that had once prided itself on being close-knit now found itself in the midst of growing controversy. As these conversations rippled through the community, they quickly reached Kayla. Friends and acquaintances began reaching out to her, expressing their concerns and asking if she had considered what was happening. Though she had only wanted to pay the fine and move on, It was becoming clear that the situation had taken on a life of its own. Kyla, already feeling uneasy about the fine, couldn't shake the sense that there was more at play here than just a simple traffic violation. She knew the town, its politics, and its complicated dynamics. Her father had built his career on trust. But this felt different. She wondered, was the fine about the registration, or was it about her last name? The questions lingered, and the more people talked, the more she realized that the conversation about her fine wasn't just about her. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. The weight of the situation hung heavily over Kyla, and she couldn't escape the growing tension around her. Every phone call, every text, every interaction with friends and acquaintances seemed to bring the issue to the forefront. The whispers were no longer subtle. They were accusations, doubts, and questions about fairness and justice. She had always kept a low profile, but now, her name was being debated in every corner of town. The fine was supposed to be a small, personal matter, yet it had turned into something much larger. Kyla couldn't let it go. She hadn't wanted to make a scene, but as she watched how things were spiraling, she knew something had to change. She called her father. "Dad, I need to talk to you. It's getting worse." Samuel Davis, ever the calm figure, had been quietly following the developments. He was aware of the conversation swirling around town, the mounting criticism of the judge, and the fact that the fine had become more of a scandal than he ever expected. He had spent the past few days weighing his options, knowing that stepping in too soon might look like an overstep, while staying silent would only fuel the fire. "I've been thinking about it," Samuel said, his voice steady but edged with concern. "We need to have a conversation with Judge Collins. This can't go on. I'm not going to let your name get dragged through the mud just because of a traffic ticket." Kyla felt a rush of relief and anxiety in equal measure. She had wanted her father's support, but she also knew the complications this conversation would bring. Her father was a respected figure, and challenging the judge, who had served in the town for years, wasn't something that would be taken lightly. "We don't need a public confrontation, Dad," Kyla said, her voice firm despite the knot in her stomach. "But we need to address the fact that this fine feels disproportionate. It's not just about me. It's about how the town sees this, how they see us." The mayor paused, his thoughts clearly racing. "I agree, but I'm not going to rush into anything. We need to approach this carefully, with respect. The last thing we want is a spectacle. Let me set up a meeting with Judge Collins." The next day, Kyla and her father met with Judge Collins in a small, neutral conference room at City Hall. The judge, though visibly uncomfortable, greeted them with his usual professional demeanor, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. He offered a polite handshake, but his eyes flickered nervously between Kyla and Samuel. "I appreciate you both coming," the judge began, clearing his throat. "I understand that this situation has caused some concerns." Samuel didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Judge, my daughter came to me with her concerns, and after some reflection, I share them. The fine she received felt disproportionate, and the way it's been handled is only escalating things." Kyla kept her voice steady. "I just want fairness. This isn't about favoritism. It's about the principle. Was my case judged with the same consideration as anyone else's, or did my last name play a role?" Judge Collins shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the weight of the question settling in. I never intended for this to escalate like it has. I made a decision based on the facts, but looking back, I understand how it could have seemed unfair. I never meant to let your name influence my judgment." The mayor studied the judge's face, searching for sincerity. "We need to ensure that this doesn't happen again, not just for Kyla, but for everyone in this town. No one should feel like they're treated differently because of who they are." There was a long silence before the judge nodded, finally acknowledging the truth in Samuel's words. "I'll take responsibility for my actions, and I'll make sure that I reassess my approach going forward." Kyla exhaled slowly, the tension in the room lifting ever so slightly. It wasn't a perfect resolution, But it was a start. The dialogue had begun, and for the first time since the fine had been issued, Kyla felt like she had regained some control over the narrative. In the days following the meeting with Judge Collins, the town was abuzz with speculation. Kyla and her father had kept their conversation with the judge private, but word quickly spread that the mayor had intervened on his daughter's behalf. While some respected the mayor's handling of the situation, others saw it as an abuse of power, a sign of favoritism in a town that already had its share of political undercurrents. Kyla tried to return to her daily routine, but the attention didn't fade. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of the town's eyes on her. People who had once barely known her name now watched her with curiosity or suspicion, and every interaction seemed tinged with a layer of judgment. The small fine, meant to be a personal matter, had exploded into something far more complicated. One afternoon, as Kyla was leaving her office, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the coffee shop down the street. A few familiar faces caught her eye, and she overheard snippets of their conversation. "Did you hear? The mayor's daughter was talking about the fine at that meeting with the judge. It's all a bit too convenient, don't you think? She thinks she's untouchable just because of her father. I've always said the mayor's been too lenient with his family." Kyla's stomach tightened, and she quickly turned to leave, not wanting to hear more. She wasn't naive. She knew that being the mayor's daughter came with both privilege and its own set of challenges. The problem was, no matter what she did, the label would always follow her. To some, she would always be seen as the privileged daughter of a powerful man. At home that evening, Kyla tried to shake off the lingering unease. Her father had assured her that things would settle down, that the attention would die down with time. But Kyla wasn't so sure. It seemed that the more the town discussed the fine, the more divided they became. She had hoped that confronting the judge would bring a resolution, but instead, it had only stirred the pot. As the days passed, the pressure on the judge increased. Activists who had initially pointed out his inconsistent rulings began organizing protests outside the courthouse, demanding accountability. The mayor, who had been silent in public about the issue, was now facing growing calls to take action against the judge. Some of his political opponents saw the situation as an opportunity to undermine his leadership, questioning his ability to maintain impartiality in his own administration. Kyla watched from the sidelines, trying to avoid becoming part of the drama. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to stay out of the limelight. She didn't want to be the focal point of a political firestorm. She just wanted to be seen as her own person, not defined by the people around her. The more she tried to distance herself, the more it seemed like the storm was closing in on her. It wasn't just the fine anymore. It was the way the town had twisted her personal situation into a political statement. And with each passing day, the fallout grew more complicated. What started as a simple mistake had now turned into a battle over power, fairness, and perception. Weeks passed, and the storm surrounding Kyla Davis showed no signs of letting up. The protests outside the courthouse continued, though their numbers were dwindling. Activists and citizens alike continued to scrutinize Judge Collins, while others rallied behind the mayor, believing the whole matter had been blown out of proportion. But amidst the growing division, Kyla found herself at a crossroads. The more she tried to distance herself from the controversy, the more it became clear that her connection to the mayor was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Samuel Davis invited Kyla to join him for a quiet dinner at a local restaurant. It was a rare moment when they could talk without the weight of politics or public scrutiny pressing down on them. As they sat in a corner booth, away from prying eyes, Samuel studied his daughter, his brow furrowed in thought. "You know, I've been thinking," Samuel said after a long pause. "Maybe it's time to stop letting other people control your story." Kyla looked up from her menu, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I mean," her father continued, his voice steady, "you don't have to hide behind my name or anyone else's. You've always carved your own path, Kyla. This situation, it's not going to be the thing that defines you unless you let it." Kyla's heart fluttered with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. It had been a long time since she had thought about defining herself on her own terms. For so long, she had been content to live in the background, to stay out of the spotlight. Now that decision had been taken from her, but perhaps her father was right. Perhaps it was time to stand up and take control of her own narrative. The next day, Kyla decided to address the situation head-on. With her father's blessing, she scheduled a meeting with the town's local newspaper. The journalist, a young woman named Claire, had been one of the few who hadn't sensationalized the story. She had remained impartial in her coverage, focusing on the legal aspects rather than the political drama. Kyla knew that Claire would give her a fair chance to explain her side of things. In the interview, Kyla spoke candidly about the fine and the events that had followed. She didn't shy away from addressing the underlying issues of power and fairness. She acknowledged that her father's position had made things complicated, but she also made it clear that she wasn't using his name as a shield. "I've always tried to live my life without leaning on the advantages of my family's name," Kyla said, her voice firm but calm. "But this situation has made me realize that there's a lot more to fairness than I thought. And I won't let anyone tell my story for me." The interview was published the next week, and Kyla's words struck a chord with many in the community. While the controversy still lingered, her decision to speak out gave people a glimpse of her true character. She wasn't just the mayor's daughter. She was a woman who valued fairness, justice, and integrity. In the weeks that followed, Kyla felt the weight begin to lift. People stopped viewing her solely through the lens of her father's influence and started to see her for who she truly was. And though the town's tension had not fully dissipated, there was a quiet respect for her courage to speak her truth. Kyla had learned something invaluable through the ordeal, that sometimes, in order to move forward, you have to embrace your own voice, no matter how uncomfortable the world around you might be. The story that had started with a small traffic violation had ended with a powerful lesson about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the world seems to be pushing you in another direction.